The most valuable cookbook in American history was never published. 60 handwritten cards in a wooden box, and one of them turned a can of salmon and a sleeve of saltine crackers into a meal that fed 4 people twice. The recipe card at 21 had no ingredients at all, just Bible verses, and the women who baked it expected you to figure out the rest yourself. And the pie at 9 made its own crust, its own filling, and its own topping from a single pour into a blender. These were not recipes that came from a magazine or a television show. They came from kitchen counters where a woman stood every morning and cooked from memory. Here are 30 forgotten recipes from Grandma's recipe box no one makes anymore. Number 30, salmon croquettes. Drain a can of salmon into a bowl, pick out the bones and skin, and mash it with a fork. Mix in a beaten egg, crushed saltine crackers, minced onion, salt, and pepper. Shape the mixture into small oval patties and fry them in hot oil until both sides turn golden brown. Canned salmon was cheap, and it sat on the pantry shelf for months. Fresh fish cost too much for most families, but the cannery made it possible for a woman in Kansas or Ohio to serve fish on a Friday night. The croquettes held together because the crackers and egg did the work of a binder, and the outside crust gave the soft fish a crunch it never had on its own. Number 29. Tomato aspic. Dissolve a packet of unflavored gelatin in hot tomato juice, add a splash of Worcestershire, a squeeze of lemon, and a pinch of celery salt. Pour it into a mold and let it set overnight in the refrigerator. The next day, unmold it onto a plate of lettuce leaves and serve it cold. Every church cookbook from the 1940s through the 1970s had at least 3 versions of this recipe. Ladies brought it to luncheons. It sat on the buffet table at every funeral. Today, if you set a tomato aspic on a table, most people under 60 would not know what they were looking at. Before I go any further, for the folks who want more recipes like these all in one place, I put together something called the Vintage Recipe Guide. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I am not going to bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 28. Stack cake. Roll thin rounds of a molasses and ginger dough, bake them until they are firm but not crisp, and stack them with stewed dried apples spread between each layer. Wrap the whole cake in cloth and let it sit for 2 or 3 days. The moisture from the apples softens the layers until the cake holds together like a single piece, dense and heavy with spice. This was an Appalachian wedding cake. Neighbors each brought 1 layer to the celebration, and the bride's popularity was measured by how tall the stack grew. The apples came from the orchard and were dried on the porch roof in late summer. Nobody bought a wedding cake in those hills. The community built one. Number 27. Scalloped corn. Mix a can of creamed corn with a can of whole kernel corn, drained. Stir in a beaten egg, crushed saltine crackers, a pour of milk, melted butter, salt, and pepper. Spread it in a buttered baking dish and bake it until the top puffs slightly and turns golden at the edges. The dish fell somewhere between a casserole and a pudding. The creamed corn made the center soft and almost custard-like, and the crackers gave it enough body to hold a shape on the plate. Women brought this to church suppers because it traveled without spilling. Corn was the one vegetable nobody argued about. Number 26. Mock apple pie. Break Ritz crackers into a pie shell, pour a syrup of sugar, cream of tartar, lemon juice, and water over them. Dot the top with butter, add the second crust, and bake it until golden. The cream of tartar and lemon juice created an acid that made the crackers taste almost exactly like cooked apples. The recipe was printed on the back of the Ritz cracker box starting in the 1930s, when apples were sometimes too expensive and crackers were not. A woman could bake a pie that fooled most of the table, and the ones who figured it out usually asked for a second slice anyway. The recipe stayed on the box for decades, and most women never told their families what was inside until the pie was gone. Number 25. Wilted lettuce salad. Pick leaf lettuce from the garden, wash it, tear it into pieces, and pile it in a bowl with sliced green onions. In a skillet, fry a few strips of bacon until they are crisp. Pull the bacon out and crumble it. Now pour a splash of vinegar and a pinch of sugar into that hot bacon fat, let it bubble for a second, and dump the whole thing over the lettuce while it is still popping. The heat wilts the leaves just enough. The fat coats everything. The vinegar cuts through the grease and the sugar rounds the whole thing out. This was a spring salad. The lettuce came from the first planting. The bacon came from the cellar. By June, the lettuce had bolted and the salad was gone until next year. Number 24, crackling cornbread. Render pork fat back until the pieces turn into small golden cracklings. Stir those cracklings straight into the cornbread batter. Pour the batter into a screaming hot greased cast iron skillet and bake it until the bottom crust turns dark and crunchy. The cracklings gave the bread little pockets of salt and fat that you hit every few bites, and the hot skillet created a crust that shattered when you broke it apart. This was not the sweet, cakey cornbread you find in restaurants today. There was no sugar in it. There was no flour in it. Cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg, lard, and the cracklings from a piece of pork the butcher sold for almost nothing. Number 23. Porcupine meatballs. Mix ground beef with uncooked rice, chopped onion, an egg, salt, and pepper. Shape the mixture into balls and place them in a baking dish. Pour a can of tomato soup thinned with water over the top, cover the dish, and bake it for about an hour. The rice cooks inside the meatball and the grains poke through the surface like the quills on a porcupine. That is where the name came from, and children remembered the name long after they forgot what the meatballs tasted like. The tomato sauce thickened as it baked and turned into a gravy that clung to the rice. 1 pound of ground beef, half a cup of rice, and a can of soup fed a family of 5 with leftovers. Number 22. Depression cake. The recipe skipped eggs entirely, used lard instead of butter, and called for water where the milk should have been. Boil the water with sugar, raisins, lard, cinnamon, cloves, and a pinch of salt. Let it cool. Stir in flour and baking soda. Pour it in a pan and bake it. The cake came out dense, dark, spicy, and moist from the raisins. Women made this during the 1930s because every ingredient cost pennies, and the ones they could not afford were simply left out. The cake needed no frosting. It sat on the counter under a cloth and lasted all week. Some families called it war cake, others called it wacky cake. The name changed, but the recipe never did. Every woman had one, a metal tin or a wooden box with a hinged lid stuffed with index cards in her own handwriting. Some cards were typed on a typewriter and taped to cardboard. Some were torn from the back of a flour sack. The recipe box was not a filing system. It was a biography. You could open it and know what her family ate for 30 years, which holidays mattered, which neighbors brought which dish to which funeral. The cards she used most were the dirtiest. The ones she never touched were the experiments that failed. Nobody published these recipes. Nobody needed to. The box was the cookbook, and the woman was the index. Number 21. Scripture cake. Follow the recipe by looking up Bible verses. Judges chapter 5, verse 25 for butter. Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 20 for sugar. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 14 for eggs. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 22 for flour. Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13 for salt. Judges chapter 4, verse 19 for milk. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 12 for raisins and figs. Numbers chapter 17, verse 8 for almonds. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 9 for cinnamon and spices. Mix it all together and bake it as a spice cake. The recipe card gave no measurements and no ordinary instructions, just the book, the chapter, and the verse. The woman who baked it was expected to know her Bible well enough to recognize the ingredient in each passage and her kitchen well enough to know how much to use. Scripture cake showed up at church bake sales, and the game was always the same. Someone would take a bite, ask for the recipe, and receive a list of verses instead of ingredients. The ones who figured it out felt like they had solved a puzzle. The ones who gave up were handed the card with a smile and told to read their Bible more carefully. The cake itself tasted like a dense, moist fruitcake, heavy with raisins and warm from the cinnamon, and it kept for days wrapped in a kitchen towel. Some women wrote the verses on one side of the card and the ingredients on the other, so the cake could be made without opening the book. But that defeated the purpose. The recipe traveled through church circles for decades, copied from card to card in careful handwriting, always the same verses in the same order, always the same quiet pride in the woman who could recite every one of them from memory. Number 20. Funeral potatoes. Shred frozen hash browns into a bowl. Mix them with sour cream, cream of chicken soup, melted butter, shredded cheddar cheese, and diced onion. Spread the mixture in a baking dish. Top it with crushed cornflakes tossed in more melted butter, and bake it until the top is golden and the inside is soft and creamy. The name said everything. This was the dish women brought to the house after someone died. It traveled well. It reheated without falling apart. It fed a crowd without requiring silverware or plates that matched. Every church in the Mountain West had 3 or 4 women who made this casserole, and every one of them believed her version was the best. Number 19. Watergate salad. Stir a box of instant pistachio pudding mix into a tub of whipped topping. Fold in a can of crushed pineapple, a cup of miniature marshmallows, and a handful of chopped pecans. Chill it for an hour and serve it in a glass bowl. The salad turned pale green, and the color was half the reason people remembered it. The name appeared in the mid-1970s, and nobody has ever settled on where it came from. The Kraft Company printed the recipe on the pudding box and called it Pistachio Delight, but the name Watergate stuck because it was more interesting. The dish showed up at every potluck and baby shower from about 1975 through the early 1990s. The marshmallows softened overnight. The pineapple kept it from being too sweet. The pecans gave it a crunch that the rest of the dish deliberately lacked. Children ate it as dessert. Adults called it a salad and served it alongside the ham. Number 18. Chow mein casserole. Brown a pound of ground beef with chopped onion and celery. Stir in a can of cream of mushroom soup, a can of cream of chicken soup, soy sauce, and a cup of uncooked rice. Pour it all into a casserole dish and bake it covered for an hour. Open it up, scatter a can of chow mein noodles across the top, and put it back in the oven for 10 more minutes. Nothing in this recipe was Chinese. The chow mein noodles came from a can made by La Choy in a factory in Michigan. The soy sauce came from the same grocery aisle, but the name sounded exotic enough to make it feel like something special on a Tuesday night. Number 17. Ham salad spread. Grind leftover ham through a meat grinder, mix it with mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, a little mustard, and chopped celery. Spread it on white bread for sandwiches or pile it on crackers for an afternoon snack. This was another recipe that existed because throwing away leftover ham was unthinkable. The meat grinder bolted to the edge of the kitchen counter, and every scrap of ham that could not be sliced went through it. The women who made ham salad did not think of it as cooking. They thought of it as finishing. The ham had already been roasted, already been carved, already fed the family once. Grinding it up and mixing it with mayonnaise was the last act of that ham, and the spread kept 3 days in the refrigerator and tasted better on day 2 than on the day it was made. There was a time when the grocery store had 4 aisles and everything in it was an ingredient: flour, sugar, lard, canned tomatoes, dried beans. You walked in knowing what you needed because you already knew what you were going to make. Then the aisles multiplied. The freezer section appeared. The boxes started showing pictures of the finished meal on the front, and the instructions said, "Heat and serve." Nobody needed a recipe box when dinner came in a tray with a foil lid. The grocery store did not take these recipes away on purpose. It made them unnecessary. And when something becomes unnecessary, it becomes forgotten. Number 16. Prune cake. Stew dried prunes until they are soft, chop them up, and fold them into a spiced batter made with cinnamon, allspice, buttermilk, and oil. Bake it in a sheet pan until a toothpick comes out clean. Spread a warm glaze of butter, sugar, and buttermilk across the top while the cake is still hot. The glaze soaks into the crumb and turns the whole thing sticky and dense. Prune cake was a church dessert. Women brought it on foil-covered trays and set it next to the fried chicken. The cake kept for days because the fruit held moisture the way butter never could. Nobody calls it prune cake anymore. The word prune disappeared from polite conversation sometime in the 1990s, and the cake went with it. Number 15. Oatmeal pie. Beat eggs with sugar, corn syrup, melted butter, and vanilla. Stir in rolled oats and a handful of shredded coconut. Pour it into an unbaked pie shell and bake it until the center is just set and the top turns golden. The filling tasted like a cross between pecan pie and a chewy oatmeal cookie, and the whole reason it existed was that oats cost a fraction of what pecans cost. A woman who wanted to serve something sweet and rich at the holiday table could bake this pie for pennies, and nobody felt shortchanged. The oats swelled in the syrup and gave the filling body. The pie sliced clean on day 2, and some women swore it tasted better cold than warm. Number 14. Tomato mac. Boil a box of elbow macaroni until it is just tender. Drain it. In the same pot, melt a spoonful of butter, add a can of stewed tomatoes with the juice, stir in the cooked macaroni, and season it with salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar. Let it cook on low heat for a few minutes until the noodles soak up some of the tomato juice and the whole pot turns soft and red. Some women added a slice of American cheese on top. Some stirred in diced onion. Some left it exactly as it was. Tomato mac was a side dish and a main course depending on what day of the week it was and what else the pantry held. On Monday, it sat next to a pork chop. On Thursday, when the pork chop was gone, it sat by itself in the center of the table and everybody ate 2 bowls. The noodles cost almost nothing. The tomatoes cost almost nothing. A single pot and a single burner, and dinner was ready in the time it took to boil water. This was not a recipe that tried to impress anyone. The index card said tomato mac in pencil, and the instructions fit on 2 lines because the woman who made it could do it with her eyes closed. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, and the recipe never changed once in 3 generations because there was nothing to improve. The pot was always the same, the spoon was always the same, and the taste was always the same, which was the only thing that mattered on a Thursday night. Number 13. Stuffed green peppers. Cut the tops off green bell peppers, pull out the seeds, and blanch them in boiling water for a few minutes. Mix ground beef with cooked rice, diced onion, salt, pepper, and a can of tomato sauce. Stuff the mixture into the peppers, stand them upright in a baking dish, pour more tomato sauce around the base, and bake until the peppers are soft and the filling is cooked through. The pepper was the bowl. The filling was the meal. The whole thing went into the oven in one dish and came out as individual servings that did not need a plate to hold them together. Leftover rice and leftover ground beef found their best purpose inside a green pepper on a Wednesday night. Number 12. Pear honey. Peel and core ripe pears, grind them through a food mill, and cook them down with sugar and a can of crushed pineapple until the mixture turns thick and golden and spreadable. Pour it into jars and seal them while the preserves are still hot. The name was a lie and everybody knew it. There was no honey in pear honey. The name came from the color and the texture, because the finished preserves looked exactly like honey and spread the same way on a hot biscuit. Women in the South made this every fall when the pear trees dropped more fruit than anyone could eat fresh. A jar of pear honey on the breakfast table meant the biscuits never went dry. There comes a day when the table seats one. The children have moved, the husband is gone, and the kitchen that once fed 6 people 3 times a day goes quiet. A lot of women stop cooking when that happens. They eat toast, they eat cereal from the box, they heat a can of soup and eat it standing at the counter. But the women who kept their recipe boxes did something different. They kept cooking. A smaller pot, a single portion, the same recipes scaled down to 1 plate set at the head of the table. Cooking for yourself is not the same as feeding a family, but it is the same kind of act. It says, this day still matters. This meal still matters. Number 11. Ambrosia salad. Drain a can of mandarin oranges and a can of pineapple chunks. Fold them into sour cream with shredded coconut, miniature marshmallows, and a handful of maraschino cherries cut in half. Chill the bowl for a few hours and serve it cold. The name meant food of the gods, and the recipe predated every version of fruit salad you have ever seen in a deli case. Your grandmother served it in a glass bowl on Thanksgiving and Easter, always cold, always sweet, always pink from the cherry juice bleeding into the sour cream. Children picked the marshmallows out first. Adults pretended they did not. Number 10. Cornbread and milk. Bake a pan of cornbread. Let it cool. Crumble a thick square of it into a tall glass, pour cold buttermilk over the top, and eat it with a spoon. This was a meal, not a side dish, not a snack. Families across the South and the Appalachian Hills ate this for supper when there was nothing else, and sometimes when there was plenty. The cornbread soaked up the buttermilk and turned into something soft and tangy, almost like a cold pudding. Some used sweet milk, some used whole milk, but the old-timers insisted on buttermilk, and they were right. The tang made the whole thing work. Number 9. Impossible pie. Pour milk, eggs, sugar, butter, vanilla, shredded coconut, and a few spoonfuls of baking mix into a blender. Blend it all together and pour it into a greased pie plate. Bake it until the center is set and the top turns golden brown. The baking mix sank to the bottom and formed its own crust. The coconut rose to the top and toasted. The filling set into a custard in the middle. 3 layers from a single pour. The recipe appeared on the back of the biscuit box in the 1970s, and the name was the selling point. 1 step, 1 dish, no rolling out dough, no crimping edges. The pie made itself, and it came out of the oven looking like somebody spent an hour on it. Women clipped the recipe, taped it to an index card, and dropped it into the box next to everything else. The whole pie cost almost nothing to make and disappeared in one sitting. Number 8. Graham cracker cake. Crush a sleeve of graham crackers into fine crumbs. Mix them with flour, baking powder, sugar, and a pinch of salt. Cream butter and sugar together, beat in eggs, and add vanilla. Alternate adding the dry mixture and milk, stirring just enough to combine. Fold in chopped pecans. Pour the batter into a greased cake pan and bake it until a toothpick comes out clean. The cake had a taste that sat somewhere between a cookie and a spice cake. The graham cracker crumbs gave it a warmth that plain flour never could, something nutty and almost honeyed without adding any honey at all. Women frosted it with cream cheese frosting, and the frosting soaked into the top layer just enough to make the first bite different from every bite after it. This was not a holiday cake. It was a Tuesday cake, a covered dish cake, a cake that showed up on a neighbor's porch with a note tucked under the plate. Number 7. Bishop's bread. Mix flour, sugar, eggs, baking powder, and a pinch of salt into a thick batter. Fold in chocolate chips, maraschino cherries, chopped walnuts, and shredded coconut. Pour it into a loaf pan and bake it until the top cracks and the inside is dense and studded with color. This was a fruitcake for people who hated fruitcake. The cherries stayed red. The chocolate melted into pockets. The walnuts kept their crunch. The bread sliced clean and lasted a week on the counter wrapped in foil. Women baked it in December and gave it away on plates covered in cellophane, and the people who received it actually ate it, which is more than most holiday baked goods can claim. Number 6. Deviled ham on crackers. Grind leftover ham fine, mix it with mayonnaise, hot mustard, a dash of cayenne pepper, and a little grated onion. Spread it on saltine crackers or toast rounds. This was an appetizer, a lunch, and an afternoon snack all in one recipe. The little red cans of Underwood deviled ham sat on every grocery shelf, but the homemade version was sharper, meatier, and nothing like what came out of a can. Your grandmother made it because she had leftover ham and a meat grinder bolted to the counter. She called it ham spread, and it disappeared before supper. Number 5. Spoon bread. Bring milk to a simmer in a heavy saucepan and slowly stir in cornmeal until the mixture thickens. Remove it from the heat. Beat in eggs, butter, salt, and a pinch of baking powder. Pour it into a greased baking dish and bake it until the top puffs up and turns golden and the center stays soft enough to serve with a spoon. Spoon bread was not bread at all. It was closer to a souffle made from cornmeal, a southern dish that came to the table in the same dish it baked in because scooping it out was the only way to serve it. The eggs made it rise. The butter made it rich. The cornmeal gave it a sweetness that came from the grain itself, not from any sugar. Number 4. Hoppin' John. Cook dried black-eyed peas with a ham hock until the peas are soft and the broth is thick. Stir in cooked rice, season it with salt and pepper, and serve it with a side of cornbread. This was a New Year's Day meal across the South. The black-eyed peas meant good luck. The cornbread meant gold. Families who skipped it felt uneasy for the rest of January. The ham hock gave the peas a smoky depth that no amount of seasoning could replace, and the rice stretched a pot of beans into enough food for the entire family and the neighbors who stopped by after church. The recipe card never gave measurements. A handful of this, a bone from that, cook it until you know. Number 3. Ribbon salad. Prepare 3 separate batches of flavored gelatin in different colors. Pour the first layer into a glass dish and chill it until it is firm. Mix sour cream into the second batch, pour it over the set first layer, and chill again. Pour the third color on top and let the whole thing set overnight. Unmold it the next day, and the salad shows 3 distinct stripes with the creamy layer running through the middle. The recipe took 2 days and no skill beyond patience. Women made ribbon salad for holidays and church potlucks because the presentation did all the talking. The colors could match the season. Red and green for Christmas, orange and yellow for Thanksgiving. The taste was nothing remarkable, but the look of it on a buffet table stopped people long enough to take a slice. Number 2. Apple butter. Cook peeled apple slices with cider, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and allspice in a heavy pot over low heat for hours, stirring often until the mixture turns dark brown and thick enough to mound on a spoon. Pour it into jars and seal them while it is still hot. Apple butter was a fall ritual. Families set a copper kettle over a fire in the yard and stirred the apples all day with a long wooden paddle, taking turns because the stirring could not stop or the bottom would scorch. The smell carried across fields. Neighbors came to help and stayed to eat. By evening, the apples had cooked down to a fraction of their original volume, and the jars lasted through the winter. A single jar on the breakfast table turned plain toast and biscuits into something worth sitting down for. Number 1. Buttermilk biscuits. Flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, cold lard or butter cut in with a fork, and just enough buttermilk to bring the dough together. Pat it out on a floured board, cut rounds with a glass, and bake them in a hot oven until the tops turn golden and the insides stay soft. The recipe card said biscuits and nothing else. No temperature, no time. The oven told her when they were done, not a clock. The smell. When the kitchen smelled right, she opened the door. These biscuits were not a side dish. They were the foundation of every other recipe in the box. They went under the gravy. They went next to the soup. They sopped up the last of the pot roast drippings on Sunday night. Every recipe in that box depended on the woman who made them, knowing how to make a biscuit by feel, without measuring, without thinking. She learned it from her mother. Her mother learned it from hers. And the day nobody in that kitchen knows how to make a biscuit from scratch is the day the recipe box finally closes for good. Salmon patties with saltine crumbs were a classic end-of-the-week dinner, the kind of meal you made when the fridge looked sad and the meat was long gone. Canned salmon was a miracle in itself, cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with enough protein to make you feel like you had not missed a step. Grandma would mix it up with crushed saltine crackers, a beaten egg, and maybe a sprinkle of onion or celery if there was any left. She would form them into small patties and fry them in the same pan that had seen 5 meals already. The result? Golden, crispy outsides with soft, savory centers. They had just enough flavor to make you forget they came from a can and not the sea. Served with peas or creamed corn, or just a dollop of mayonnaise on the side, it was the kind of humble meal that never needed applause. It showed up quietly, did its job, and vanished without complaint. But it left everyone full and just a little more hopeful. That is what dinner was supposed to do. Not impressed, not sparkle, just comfort. And that is exactly what these little salmon cakes delivered. Cold salmon loaf with cucumber sauce looked like something from a buffet table but was made with canned fish and scraps. You flaked the salmon, canned if fresh was too much, then mixed it with breadcrumbs, eggs, lemon juice, and seasoning before shaping it into a loaf and baking. Once cooled, it was sliced and served cold, usually with a cucumber sauce made from sour cream or mayo and finely chopped cucumber. This dish showed up often in the 1950s and 1960s cookbooks, especially in regions where summer meant heat and no one wanted the stove on. Cold dinners were in. Molded ones were even better. You could make it early, chill it, and slice it up at dinner time without breaking a sweat. It was elegant in its own quiet way. Some added celery or pickles, others kept it smooth. Either way, it answered the question of what to eat when the heat made everything else unbearable. This was not just a baked bean and hot dog dinner. This was the working family's answer to hunger, chaos, and a kitchen clock that never slowed down. Grandma would take a can of baked beans, thick, sweet, and molasses dark, and heat it slowly on the stove. Then came the franks, sliced into coins and tossed in until they plumped up like little balloons. Sometimes she would add a spoonful of brown sugar or a shake of mustard, but most nights she just stirred and served. It was hot, sticky, smoky, and completely effortless. The beans coated the franks like syrup over pancakes, and it went best with a buttered slice of toast or a side of cornbread if the oven was already warm. Kids would gobble it down in minutes. Grown-ups would sigh, eat quietly, and go back for seconds. It was the kind of stovetop magic that made do with what you had and somehow made it taste better than it should. You never forgot the smell. And even if you rolled your eyes when she made it, you would ask for it again once life got harder and you needed something easy. That is what made it a keeper. Mock chicken legs, better known as city chicken, were a Depression-era idea that stuck around. You took cubes of pork or veal, skewered them, rolled them in flour, egg, and breadcrumbs, then fried or baked them until golden. The idea was to mimic fried chicken legs when chicken cost too much. And you know what? It worked. Cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1970s printed this recipe again and again. In summer, these skewers were served with slaw or cucumbers, something cool to balance the heat. You could reheat them or pack them for a picnic. A pound or two of meat could feed a full family. For families in cities where meat came from the butcher, not a backyard coop, this recipe was gold. It looked like a feast, even if it was scraps. Today, you hardly see city chicken, but people who remember it still say it tasted better than the real thing. 3 bean molded salad was one of those curious creations from vintage cookbooks that made vegetables and gelatin collide in the strangest way. You would take the classic 3-bean salad, green beans, wax beans, kidney beans, and suspend the whole thing in lemon or lime-flavored gelatin, set it in a mold, and proudly serve it at potlucks or family dinners. Back in the 1950s and 60s, molded salads were a rite of passage in every community cookbook, and this one was no different. It looked fancy, stretched pantry staples, and made sure not a single bean went to waste. People loved it for the bright colors, wobbly texture, and how it sat proudly next to roast meats or casseroles. It might sound a little off-putting now, but back then, molded salads were considered practical and even impressive. This one in particular packed protein, vegetables, and a little retro flair all in one strange, shimmering dish. You might not see it outside of vintage recipe cards today, but once upon a time, it was the talk of every potluck. Sloppy Joes had already earned their place in the American kitchen by the time Grandma figured out how to make them faster. Instead of hamburger buns, she grabbed slices of toast, whatever white sandwich bread was left in the bread box. Ground beef got tossed into the skillet with a little onion, then drowned in a quick mix of ketchup, mustard, and a pinch of sugar if you had it. No special seasonings, no packets, no fuss. Once the mixture was bubbling, it got spooned right over the toast and served just like that, open-faced, hot, and ready to fall apart in your hands. That was half the fun. It dripped, it stained your fingers, and it always tasted better the messier it was. This was a dinner for families who were too tired to sit proper but still wanted to eat together. It was loud, quick, and honest. And even though it came from a time of tight belts and short patience, it tasted like something you might pay good money for at a diner today. That is the thing about sloppy Joe toast. It always fed more than just your stomach. Baked stuffed zucchini boats were the garden's way of saying dinner was ready. If you had zucchini growing out back, and most families did, you eventually ended up with more than you could use. That is where this recipe came in. You sliced the zucchini, scooped out the center, and stuffed it with breadcrumbs, sausage, herbs, onions, and a little cheese if you had it. Then it went into the oven until golden on top and tender underneath. The result was warm, filling, and surprisingly hearty for a dish with no meat front and center. This was not just about using produce, it was a centerpiece. In the 1960s and 1970s, garden cookbooks practically demanded this dish. It was meat-stretching, kid-pleasing, and oven-friendly. You could eat it warm or cold, toss in a tomato slice or two, and it became a full summer supper. Today it might pass as vegetarian rustic. Back then, it was just smart cooking. Macaroni and tomatoes was the forgotten side that kept dinner plates full when grocery budgets were stretched thin. You would boil macaroni, toss it with stewed tomatoes, a pat of butter, and maybe onions or cheese if you had extra. It was not glamorous, but it got the job done. You could find this simple pasta side in old community cookbooks from the 40s through the 70s, tucked between casserole recipes and Jell-O molds. Families loved it because it used pantry staples, cost little, and made meals stretch farther. It showed up next to pork chops, meatloaf, or whatever leftovers you had. Macaroni and tomatoes was the quiet hero of the table, filling bellies when money was tight. You do not see it much now, but in its day it was a practical filling side that showed how far folks could go with a box of pasta and a can of tomatoes. Creamed peas on buttered toast was one of those meals that whispered instead of shouted. It never tried to impress anyone. It was made for quiet nights, empty fridges, and long weeks. Grandma would melt a little butter in a pan, add canned peas, sometimes drained, sometimes not, and stir in milk and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken it. Salt, pepper, maybe a dash of sugar if the peas were too sharp. Then she would ladle the warm, creamy mix over thick slices of buttered toast. It was soft, it was mild, it was the edible version of a warm blanket. Nobody bragged about it, and no one ever asked for seconds out loud. But the plate was always clean by the end. It was a meal that held your hand, quietly filled you up, and gave you the strength to keep going. In some homes, it was the only hot food all week, and even if you had fancier ingredients or a longer grocery list, you still came back to this because it made you feel like a kid again. Just peas and bread and thyme. That was more than enough. Canned peach and cottage cheese ring mold was the cold supper your grandmother swore by, and for good reason. Molded in a ring pan, it started with plain gelatin, mixed with the syrup from canned peaches, folded together with cottage cheese, diced peaches, and sometimes crushed pineapple or chopped nuts. Once set, it came out as a shimmering circle of pastel fruit and cream, served cold with a dinner roll or a spoonful of mayonnaise on the side. That might sound strange now, but this was a meal built for heat. It did not require an oven. It could be made the night before, and it was filling in that oddly satisfying way that old-fashioned suppers tend to be. This recipe showed up constantly in homemaker magazines and fundraising cookbooks during the 1950s through the 1970s. It was meant to be practical and pretty. You could make it with what you had in your pantry, and it made use of canned goods in a way that felt fresh. People served it at luncheons, baby showers, or just on nights when nobody wanted to cook. It was elegant on a dime, a little weird by today's standards, and a real piece of summer dinner history. Scalloped cabbage bake was the kind of side dish that stretched a head of cabbage farther than you thought possible, and it came straight out of those old community cookbooks where frugal comfort food was king. You would slice the cabbage, soften it in boiling water, then bake it in layers with creamy sauce, breadcrumbs, and sometimes a little cheese if you had extra on hand. It sounds simple, but when it came bubbling out of the oven, golden on top and rich underneath, it turned cabbage into pure comfort food. Families leaned on dishes like this during the Great Depression and World War II, when ingredients were scarce and every meal had to go the distance. Scalloped cabbage bake filled plates at church suppers, potlucks, and Sunday dinners all across America, sitting proudly next to ham, roast chicken, or casseroles. It might not win any beauty contests now, but back then it meant a warm, filling meal made with care. In tough times, even the humblest cabbage could be turned into something worth gathering around the table for. There were two things nearly every kitchen had back then: creamed corn and hot dogs. When both of them landed in the same skillet, dinner was practically done. This was the kind of meal Grandma made when time was short and kids were restless. She would slice the hot dogs into little coins and toss them into a buttered pan until they browned just right around the edges. Then came the creamed corn, thick, sweet, and silky from the can. It all got mixed together into a bubbling, golden mess that looked questionable to some but tasted like warm security. You could eat it on its own, spoon it over bread, or mop it up with the last slice of toast from breakfast. Nobody called it gourmet, but everyone called it dinner. It filled your belly, cleaned out the pantry, and gave you one less thing to worry about. And somehow, it was the meal that lingered in memory more than any roast or fancy casserole. Maybe it was the smell. Maybe it was how fast it came together. Or maybe it was just that it tasted better when you were young, hungry, and too impatient to wait for something fancier. Ham and banana casserole is one of those recipes that makes you stop and read the page twice. But once upon a time, this odd couple was a regular guest at summer dinners across suburban America. It started with slices of ham wrapped around whole bananas, arranged in a casserole dish and baked with mustard sauce poured over the top. The mustard added a tangy kick, and the bananas softened into the kind of texture that people back then thought of as fancy. Some even added shredded cheddar cheese. It was quirky, no doubt about it. But in the 1950s and 1960s, cookbooks were full of strange pairings that somehow worked. This dish was a crowd pleaser for its novelty as much as its taste. And in hot weather, it was easy to make without much fuss. It showed up at church potlucks, birthday parties, and even weeknight dinners when the fridge was running low. Today, people may cringe at the combo, but for families back then, it was just another way to stretch meat and fruit into a full meal. It is the kind of thing you might laugh at now, but remember fondly if you grew up scraping mustard sauce off your plate. Pineapple cheese salad sounds like one of those retro recipes that people talk about with equal parts horror and nostalgia, but this sweet and savory mashup was a potluck star once upon a time. You would mix canned pineapple chunks with shredded cheddar cheese and mayonnaise, sometimes tossing in a maraschino cherry on top to seal the deal. It sounds like a strange combination today, but back in the 1950s and 60s, recipes like this came straight out of the old spiral-bound cookbooks tucked in every kitchen drawer. People loved it for its bright, tangy sweetness and how easy it was to throw together with cheap pantry staples. Pineapple cheese salad showed up at luncheons, holiday tables, and potlucks, holding its own next to roast turkey, ham, or casseroles. It might raise a few eyebrows now, but back then, that quirky little salad was a way to dress up a meal and bring something special to the table without spending a fortune. In its day, this strange, creamy creation meant you came prepared. Quick tomato and rice soup was less of a recipe and more of a family habit. It started with canned tomato soup, the kind that came in a red and white can and waited patiently in your pantry for its moment. Instead of milk or water, Grandma would stir in leftover rice from the night before, just a scoop or two, enough to bulk it up and stretch it across the whole table. The rice gave it body, the soup gave it flavor, and together they made something more than the sum of their parts. It simmered on the stove while she folded laundry or paid bills at the kitchen table. It was the smell that told you dinner was ready, not the clock. No one complained that it was simple. In fact, that was the point. You could top it with cheese, swirl in a bit of cream, or eat it plain with saltines on the side. Whatever the case, it went down smooth, warmed you up fast, and made a long day feel less heavy. It might not win any ribbons, but it won over every empty stomach it ever met. Corn fritter suppers were one of those magical meals that felt light but filled you up fast. Made from fresh corn cut off the cob, mixed with flour, eggs, and a splash of milk, these fritters were dropped into hot oil until golden brown and crisp. You would pile them high on a plate, sometimes dusted with salt or drizzled with syrup if the mood called for it. But the real trick was what came on the side. Thick tomato slices, chilled and sprinkled with pepper, or a scoop of cottage cheese gave the meal its balance. This was not a starter. This was dinner. A hot, crunchy, fresh off the skillet kind of dinner that made the house smell like summer. Cookbooks from the 1940s to the 1970s were packed with corn fritter recipes, each with its own little spin. Some added chives, some tossed in bits of bacon or green pepper. But they all revolved around one thing: making corn the star. If you had a garden or access to a roadside farm stand, corn fritters were an obvious choice. They were fast, easy, and cheap, and they made everyone at the table feel like they were eating something special. Corn pudding casserole was the side dish that made even the humblest dinner plate feel warm and complete. If you flipped through old recipe cards tucked behind flour jars, chances are this one was written in your grandmother's handwriting. It combined sweet corn, butter, eggs, and milk into a creamy bake that sat proudly next to roast ham or pork chops. It was easy, affordable, and filled bellies, making it a go-to for potlucks, church suppers, and holidays. The top baked up golden brown, the inside stayed soft and rich, and every bite reminded you how folks pulled meals together from what they had. Corn pudding casserole carried meals through tough times, earning its place in kitchens from the Depression to the 70s. You do not see it much now, but back then, that creamy baked corn meant comfort on a plate. This one came straight out of the open the pantry and hope for a miracle school of cooking. Scrambled eggs with canned chili was never in any cookbook, but it made it onto plates across America faster than most 5-ingredient dinners. Grandma would beat a few eggs with whatever milk she had left, toss them in a skillet, and stir them just until they were barely set. Then came the chili, straight from the can, full of beans and spice and a little bit of mystery meat. It would warm right on top of the eggs until the kitchen smelled like a diner on a slow afternoon. A few slices of toast on the side, maybe a wedge of cheese if you were lucky, and you had yourself a meal. It was hearty, messy, and completely satisfying. No one asked what brand the chili was or whether the eggs were farm fresh. What mattered was that it was hot, filling, and on the table in 10 minutes. It was meals like this that made it possible to get through the rest of the week. And once you have eaten it once, you will understand why it never needed a recipe. Sliced tomato pie with biscuit crust was a midsummer miracle born from the garden and the oven. Tomatoes were the star, big, juicy ones sliced thick and layered over a buttery biscuit dough pressed into a pie pan. Between the layers went onion, herbs, and sometimes cheddar or dollops of mayo, depending on the cookbook. Once baked, the tomatoes softened and sweetened, and the crust puffed up around the edges. The result was messy, fragrant, and comforting. This pie was not dessert, and it was not just a side, it was dinner. Served warm or room temperature, it filled the house with the smell of summer. Families used it to deal with too many tomatoes and a desire to skip meat. It was practical and indulgent. You could throw in corn or breadcrumbs. Some added a top crust, but most kept it open-faced. It faded when people stopped baking from scratch. But those who remember it will tell you it was magic. Mock oyster casserole, also known as eggplant dressing, was one of those clever Depression-era recipes that made its way into old cookbooks and never fully disappeared. The name might raise a few eyebrows now, but the whole point was to create a rich, flavorful casserole that mimicked the texture and heartiness of oyster stuffing without needing expensive seafood. You would take cooked eggplant, breadcrumbs, onions, and herbs, bake it until golden on top, and serve it as a side dish at holiday dinners or Sunday suppers. It filled out the table, stretched garden produce, and made even the simplest meal feel just a little more complete. Back then, you could find recipes like this scribbled in the margins of faded cookbooks or passed along at church potlucks. People knew how to make do with what they had, and this casserole proved that even eggplant could stand in for something fancier. You might not find it on modern menus, but back then, eggplant dressing was a practical, comforting side that made every meal feel just a little more special. Peanut butter and bacon sounds like a dare today, but to Grandma, it was just Tuesday lunch. This was a sandwich born in the tail end of the Great Depression and carried proudly into the next decade by people who knew how to stretch every ingredient. She would fry up strips of bacon until they crackled, drain them on the same paper towel she used all week, then lay them across a thick spread of peanut butter on white sandwich bread. That was it. No lettuce, no tomato, no fancy mayonnaise. Just salt, fat, protein, and speed. Kids loved the crunch. Grown-ups loved how it filled you up without burning through the grocery budget. And for something so strange-sounding, it just worked. The warmth of the bacon softened the peanut butter slightly, and the two came together like old friends who had nothing in common but always got along. Sometimes she would add a second slice of bread, but often it was open-faced and served cold. It was portable, practical, and surprisingly satisfying. And in homes where time was short and mouths were many, that counted for everything. You might laugh at it now, but one bite would probably bring it all back. This one might raise some eyebrows today, but back in the day, pork chops with rhubarb compote were about as close to gourmet as summer dinners got. You would sear the chops in a cast-iron skillet, brown them up good, and then serve them with a sauce made from stewed rhubarb, vinegar, and a little sugar if you had any to spare. The result? Sweet, tangy, juicy, and warm. Rhubarb was a big deal back then, especially in areas where the plant grew wild or right in someone's backyard. If you had a patch, you had dinner. This recipe showed up in a lot of cookbooks because it was reliable. Even tough cuts of meat got elevated with enough rhubarb sauce on top. It was common to serve it with a scoop of mashed potatoes or white bread to soak up the juices. Not everyone liked the sharp bite of rhubarb, especially kids, but the grown-ups appreciated its practicality. It kept well, cooked fast, and paired perfectly with pork. Some versions added cloves or nutmeg. Others threw in onions or swapped the rhubarb for stewed apples when the season passed. Either way, this dish captured the feeling of summer dinners cooked low and slow with whatever you had on hand. Buttered parsley potatoes were the kind of humble, forgotten side dish that quietly filled plates and satisfied appetites across America, especially during lean times. You would boil small baby potatoes, toss them in butter, sprinkle with chopped parsley, and serve them up next to roast beef, fried chicken, or whatever you had on the table that night. It was not flashy, but back in the day, that was the whole point. Simple, affordable, filling, and easy to dress up with ingredients straight from your garden or pantry. You would find recipes like this tucked in the pages of faded cookbooks from the 1930s to the 70s, passed along at potlucks and family dinners. Buttered parsley potatoes were proof that you did not need much to make a side dish feel complete. They soaked up gravy, balanced out heavier meals, and stretched your groceries farther when money was tight. These days, they have slipped off most dinner tables, but back then, a bowl of buttery potatoes meant you brought comfort, simplicity, and just a little bit of pride to the meal. Ham and applesauce might sound fancy today, but back in the day, it was just something Grandma could throw together before the table was even set. Sliced ham went straight into a hot skillet, sometimes with just a dab of butter or the leftover fat from breakfast. A quick sear on each side was all it needed. Meanwhile, the applesauce, homemade if you had a backyard tree, canned if you were in a hurry, was warming on the back burner. This was dinner you could smell from the front porch. The saltiness of the ham played off the soft, tart sweetness of the apples in a way that felt balanced, simple, and oddly comforting. It was a meal for days when you were tired, when groceries were thin, or when you just needed something that felt familiar. And the best part? No oven. No long wait. Just a skillet, a spoon, and a little heat. Folks might not talk about ham and applesauce as a main course anymore, but for a generation raised on wartime thrift and flavor that did not waste time, this was a weeknight miracle. If you ever needed proof that sweet and salty go hand in hand, here it is. Pineapple glazed ham steak with minted peas. Sounds fancy now, but it came from kitchens trying to make dinner fast and special. A thick slice of ham, cut from a round or canned variety, was seared in a skillet, then brushed with a glaze of pineapple juice, brown sugar, and mustard. As it sizzled, the glaze caramelized and formed a golden crust. Minted peas were the quick side, just frozen or fresh peas warmed with butter and a few mint leaves. It was fast and used shelf-stable and frozen ingredients, but it looked thoughtful. Cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s praised it for its balance and bright flavor. The pineapple made it sweet. The mustard gave it a kick. The peas kept it fresh. You could make this in 20 minutes and still feel proud. On a summer night when the house felt too still, something warm and sweet like this hit the spot. Golden Glow carrot salad was one of those bright, zesty side dishes that added color and crunch to dinner tables, especially when meals were built around whatever you could grow or stretch from the pantry. You would take shredded carrots, mix them with lemon-flavored gelatin, and fold in crushed pineapple for sweetness, letting the whole thing set into a glossy, citrusy mold that practically glowed on the plate. It sounds unusual now, but back then, molded salads were a potluck favorite, and this one stood out for its bold color and refreshing bite. Families leaned on recipes like this because it was affordable, easy to throw together, and made even the humblest meals feel a little more special. Golden Glow carrot salad showed up at Sunday suppers, holiday spreads, and backyard picnics, sitting proudly next to roast chicken, casseroles, or fried pork chops. Its stretched ingredients added brightness to heavy plates and gave meals that cheerful, homemade touch. You hardly see it now, but once upon a time, this glowing salad was a quiet symbol of kitchen creativity and making do with simple, practical ingredients. Grilled cheese and pineapple sandwiches were one of Grandma's best-kept secrets, the kind of meal that made you raise an eyebrow right before you fell in love with it. It started like any grilled cheese, with slices of bread and whatever cheese was available. But right before the second slice went on, she would place a canned pineapple ring right in the middle of the sandwich. Then it all went into the skillet with butter hissing underneath. The cheese melted, the pineapple softened, the bread crisped to a golden crunch. The end result? A sandwich that was both savory and sweet, crispy and juicy. It was like dinner and dessert in one bite, and it somehow worked better than anyone expected. She made it on Fridays, or on days when the pantry was almost bare, but the craving for something different was strong. The smell of warm pineapple and browned butter filled the house and lingered even after the dishes were done. Kids loved it. Grown-ups pretended they did not, until they asked for seconds. It was quick, clever, and full of unexpected joy. Just like her. Stuffed tomato platters with egg salad filling were the summer version of keeping it simple without losing the charm. You would start with the ripest tomatoes you could find, usually picked right from the garden or bought cheap from a neighbor's stand. Slice them in half, scoop out a bit of the center, and fill them with homemade egg salad. Not the store-bought kind either. This egg salad was chopped eggs, mustard, a bit of mayonnaise, and maybe a sprinkle of paprika or chopped pickle for punch. Then the filled tomatoes would be plated on a bed of lettuce, often with saltines on the side, and a tall glass of iced tea. This was not a lazy meal. It was intentional, refreshing, and bright. The kind of plate that made you feel taken care of even when money was tight and the kitchen was sweltering. These showed up at bridge club meetings, baby showers, and Sunday dinners when nobody felt like cooking. The tomatoes cooled the egg salad. The lettuce gave it a little crunch. And if you were lucky, someone would have tossed in some sweet relish just right. The whole thing was cold, clean, and deeply satisfying. A real taste of summer simplicity. Cottage cheese Jell-O salad was one of those curious creations that somehow became a potluck staple all across America. It mixed creamy cottage cheese with lemon or lime gelatin, and if that was not bold enough, people often added celery, grated carrots, or pineapple chunks. You would walk into a family reunion or church dinner in the 1940s, and there it was, wobbling in all its glory next to fried chicken or meatloaf. People loved it because it looked presentable, stretched ingredients, and felt like something special during tight grocery budgets. You might not see it on modern tables, but back then, molded salads were more than a trend. They were pure kitchen creativity when you had to make do. This one came straight from old community cookbooks with curled pages and faded ink, the kind passed down through families who knew how to stretch every dollar. Bologna and egg scramble was the go-to dinner when breakfast never quite happened and lunch was already a blur. It started with slices of bologna, thick and pink and curled at the edges, hitting the hot pan with a sizzle. Grandma would brown them until they crisped at the edges, then crack in a few eggs and give it all a quick scramble. No measuring, no garnish, just protein and grease and flavor. Sometimes she would add a little shredded cheese if she had some, but it was not necessary. This was about getting food on the table without making it a project. The bologna gave the eggs a smoky, salty edge, and the eggs softened everything just enough to go down easy. Served in bowls, over toast, or straight from the skillet, no one ever walked away hungry. It was simple, dependable, and tasted a whole lot fancier than it had any right to. You could make it in 10 minutes, clean up in 5, and be done with the day before the sun went down. Some meals were special because they were rare. This one was special because it was always there. Cold macaroni ring with tuna and peas was one of those make-ahead meals that looked like a party but tasted like pantry staples. It started with elbow macaroni, cooked and cooled, then tossed with mayonnaise, canned tuna, peas, chopped celery, and a touch of lemon juice. The whole mixture was packed into a ring mold and chilled for hours until it held its shape. Come dinner time, you flipped it out onto a plate and maybe garnished it with parsley or extra peas. This was dinner, not a side dish, and certainly not just for potlucks. It showed up in homemaker cookbooks throughout the 1950s and 1960s as a cool supper for hot days when no one wanted to turn on the stove. The peas gave it color. The tuna gave it protein. The macaroni made it stick to your ribs. You would slice it like a cake and serve it with iced tea and saltines. It was pretty in its own quiet way, and somehow it always worked. Some people added pimentos or chopped olives for flair. Others kept it plain and reliable. It is easy to laugh at a tuna ring now, but back then it was a little miracle of convenience and charm. Celery Victor sounds like a recipe that came from a fancy hotel menu, but this marinated celery dish made its way into regular households thanks to those old cookbook collections in every drawer. It was as simple as boiling celery until tender, chilling it in broth or vinegar, and serving it up with herbs or hard-boiled eggs when you wanted to show off. You could find it at potlucks or holiday tables, dressed up to look fancier than it was. People back then knew how to stretch even the humblest ingredients into something worthy of company. Celery Victor turned plain celery into a crisp, tangy salad that felt like a proper side dish next to roasted meats or casseroles. It showed up in cookbooks throughout the 1930s and 40s, passed along at church suppers and family gatherings. Cold dinners had a way of sneaking into the rotation, especially during sticky summers or long days when even boiling water felt like a chore. Cottage cheese and canned peach plates were Grandma's way of keeping things simple but still making it look like she tried. She would scoop a big spoonful of cottage cheese onto a plate, nestle a golden peach half beside it, and top the whole thing with a maraschino cherry if she was feeling fancy. Some people used lettuce as a bed. Others just reached for a fork and got to work. It was creamy, sweet, and oddly refreshing, the kind of combination you only appreciate once you grow up and remember it out of nowhere. The peaches added just enough syrupy sunshine, and the cottage cheese made sure you did not go to bed hungry. It was also what she served when she wanted to eat light but still feed the whole house. This was not a dinner that tried to win over picky eaters. It was a dinner that said, "This is what we have, and it will do just fine." And somehow, it did. Not every meal needed heat or noise. Some just needed quiet. Stuffed green peppers with rice and corn were a humble summer dish that did not need anything extra to feel like a full meal. Peppers were halved, seeded, and filled with cooked rice, corn, chopped onions, and sometimes tomato sauce. Everything was spooned in and baked until the peppers softened, then topped with a little cheese if available. It made you feel full without being heavy. In farm communities and suburbs, peppers were easy to grow or buy cheap from roadside stands. That made them a go-to when money was tight but hunger was not. The corn and rice stretched the filling. You could feed 6 with just a few peppers and a pan of rice. Some added beans or leftover meat, but many made the vegetarian version just fine. It was colorful. It was fragrant. It sat proudly on the table like it had something to prove. and for many summers it did. Rice ring with creamed vegetables was the side you pulled out to impress, even if all you had was rice, peas, and a few carrots. This molded rice dish showed up at luncheons, community suppers, and potlucks from the 1930s to the 60s, proving how fancy rice could look with the right presentation. You cooked seasoned rice, packed it into a bundt or gelatin mold, and once it's set, filled the center with creamy peas, carrots, and maybe mushrooms or green beans if you had them. It was affordable, filling, and looked fancier than it really was. These molded sides were all the rage, straight from vintage cookbooks with curled edges and faded ink. Rice ring with creamed vegetables was a no-nonsense way to stretch pantry staples while making the table look proper. You hardly see it outside old recipe cards now, but back then, it was a thrifty, creative dish that added kitchen pride to any meal. 30 recipes that never made it into a single printed cookbook, and the only copies that ever existed were written in pencil by the women who cooked them. Open a drawer in your mother's kitchen this weekend. Look for the box. If you find it, make the biscuits first, because everything else in that box was built on top of them. If you have been watching this far, hit subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. Tell me in the comments which recipe from this list your family still makes. I am James with Vintage Lifestyle USA, and there is always something worth cooking.